Hello, this is James Reese for another edition of Razor Wire. I'd like to introduce you guys to Stephen Allor from Secure Code Warrior. He's the global head of partners. He's wonderfully agreed to come and be interviewed by me. So, Stephen, do you want to just kind of give yourself a bit of an intro to the chaps who are watching?
Sure, thanks, Jim, and appreciate the invitation to come on your show here. So, as Jim said, my current responsibilities are the head of our global partner program. I've had the opportunity to be with Secure Code Warrior for the last 4.5 years, when we were less than a dozen people on a global basis, and helped grow the business since then, and really see the impact that we've experienced in the industry that we'll talk a little bit further about as we go forward. I mean, my background, and I know you're talking to a variety of different people with various backgrounds. I would say I'm more of the business background coming into security. Many of the companies I worked for early on, they were all technology companies, but I've always been on the sales and business development side of helping organizations grow. But really my bias and kind of orientation has always been around solutions that impact businesses to do something different or be better or different, tomorrow than they are today. So I have much more of a business orientation and an impact, even from a technology standpoint, because for me, it's much more interesting to deliver something that truly, delivers value to enable your customers or your customers' customers to fundamentally have a different and better experience tomorrow because of it. So the interesting parallel here is that, coming into Secure Code Warrior, I looked at the industry, which was always an interesting industry to pursue, but I always saw it as being highly technical. And when I started to talk to the founders about this opportunity and what they were doing, it really started to intrigue me, because it was really about making a transformational impact in a very important part of the industry at large, which is developers, and helping them fundamentally do things differently tomorrow than they do today, which ultimately changes the world. And you only have to watch, 5 minutes of news to hear some clip somewhere about some exploit happening. And a third of that cyber risk is associated with application exploits or exploits. And it's a big part of the threats that, we all experience or we're all susceptible to. And it's one that the problems, as far as how do you impact that positively, aren't easy and straightforward. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But I think as you look at various backgrounds within the industry, I look at this as, a way to apply an approach in an industry that's, has increasing needs, and make an impact around how people do what they do, and how that can have a cascading and positive impact for the organizations that they work for and the customers that they serve, which ends up being, all of us, right? Because of the nature of the world today.
Fantastic. No, I mean, absolutely agree. I mean, you've been dealing with kind of the security side of technology now for quite a while, haven't you? I mean, it's been a while. Looking at your bio, it's what, 2003, I think it was.
Yeah, so on one side it was on the analytics side. So it started really in fraud. So one of the early cyber crimes, right, was telecom and telecom fraud, and exploits happening for financial gain, which is really the definition of crime and fraud in the first place. And the interesting thing is that the techniques that you use to identify telecom fraud, right, are similar but different. And as the network went from switches and routers, right, to the mobile network, where it became a little bit more digital, to ultimately packets of data, it's funny, when I was on that side of the fence, I thought of things as, from a data perspective, of, well, how can you inspect a packet of data and determine if there's fraudulent behavior in that communication? And it was really interesting when I came to Secure Code Warrior and saw it from a different vantage point, where at some point that's interesting. But then what becomes even more meaningful is that it's not necessarily the events that are fraudulent, although you can detect that behavior, but it's more about the actions and what they're able to do and how they're able to do it, which opens up a whole new world of challenges.
Absolutely. I mean, I've been in InfoSec for 25 years, and things have changed really dramatically from what it was like back then. I mean, back then, a lot of InfoSec was based around keeping things running. People were doing some massive amounts of development back then. The internet was still very, very early in its inception. You know, we didn't have Google, we didn't have kind of Amazon, we didn't have anything like that. It was very early days stuff. And back then, people were more worried. A lot of InfoSec was based around keeping things running. Software that would just fall over because it was badly developed, or maybe not badly developed, but it was still very early days stuff. I mean, innovation was occurring all over the place, and the real game changer for me was when e-commerce became a thing, because that's when fraud started to go crazy. The first couple of malicious individuals who discovered that they could start hijacking stuff, getting credit card information, and cloning those cards, which was the early problems that people faced, really changed everything. And it was weird because it was a bit strange. I was having a conversation I was doing an interview with somebody else, a guy called sort of Richard Cassidy, and he was saying how it's a battle, and it's an ever evolving battle as well, because innovation and code development and software development has been getting more and more refined, bigger and bigger and bigger projects, bigger. I mean, look at it this way. Everything's digital now. I can't think of anything that isn't, that we've dealt with in recent years. Whether you're a SCADA system that's looking after water. I mean, look at that problem that happened recently where hackers got in and started trying to fiddle with I can't remember what it was, but the amounts of a chemical within the waterworks. It's like, this is where we are now, and it's all software driven. And in the early days of software development, nobody cared about security. I'd get in front of a group of developers and say, "Oh, what are you guys doing about security?" And they'd be like, "Don't stifle my creativity, man." But things have
very
changed.
much the reaction, right? It was just, it was maybe imposed more, not by you, of course, but by others, as an audit function, right? And it was a checks and balance, which is the artist's, worst nightmare. Is what do you know about my work to be able to grade it? And I don't know if it's changed, exponentially since then, as far as the perception that there is this animosity that's grown and developed because of that checks and balance that's required. And I think different organizations, the approach that you take ultimately creates or fosters that animosity or togetherness, if you will.
In the early days, it was very much, it was very hostile, very, very, very early days. I'm talking 20 years ago. Nowadays, because people have seen some of the stuff that's happened recently, and everything related to a lot of it is either failures in software, vulnerabilities to do with software. There is a big social element. I mean, let's look at ransomware, for instance. That's a massive epidemic at the moment, and that relies on people to run software that's bad, that's going to cause backdoors. But there are, there are brokers who will broker. They've broken into systems. They will sell access to those systems, and that's when you get the real criminals go in. I say the real criminals; they're all culpable, but it's coding has gotten so much better at realizing that security is a part of it. I mean, OWASP was quite big back in the day, but what you guys are doing at Secure Code Warrior is on a different level, because one of the things I experienced when putting in, like, even just kind of security awareness programs where you kind of train people up on how to be secure and what to look for and all the rest of it, we've always had a bit of a problem when it came to developers, because you're almost trying to tell them how to do their work, and nobody
Right.
likes to be told by somebody who's not in their discipline how to do the discipline.
Right.
So do you want to talk about a bit about what Secure Code Warrior is doing? Because I think that's really, really important, and it is a big missing link that we've been suffering from for a while now until you
No,
guys
we
came
have.
along.
We have, and a piece of it, and I'll answer that question in a second, but a piece of it. So when I made the shift from, say, one element of cybercrime to Secure Code Warrior, one of the observations I had, right, it's this massive industry, and thousands of companies that are trying to help our customers do things differently to prevent this from happening. And, from an outsider in perspective, it's, I looked at it and I said, when I went to business school, and everything that I've learned is that, running an effective business or solving problems was about understanding the people, the process, and then thinking about the systems that needed to be changed or improved, et cetera. And, walking around, RSA conference floor, right, just gives you a staggering and overwhelming feeling back in the days when we were at conferences, that it's all about technology, right? And who's got the greatest technology to go solve this particular problem or in this way, and and defend the wall, if you will. And the fact is that people continue to get inside the fort, and if you don't secure what's inside that organization, then it doesn't matter what you're putting out there. So I saw that dichotomy, if you will. So really, from our standpoint, right, in the old days, developers were seen as the part of the problem, as were employees, right? Mm-hmm. Employees were the ones that clicked on, phishing emails and unknowingly started to download malware, and they're the problem. But really, they're the solution. And there's only so much technology you can throw at the problem and react to it before you have to say, how do we do things differently? So our whole vision and focus is to inspire developers to embrace a preventative secure coding approach that enables every team to ship quality software with confidence. And it's about changing behavior, helping developers build a skill and do things differently tomorrow that they're really not trained to do in the first place, and do it well, which is not an easy challenge to overcome, because both the technical realities of the languages in which developers speak or write, and the fact that most developers learn most of what they know how to do today from their functional proficiency on the job. So it's a 50 or 60-year-old profession that is more of an art than a science compared to the likes of electrical engineering or mechanical engineering that have been around for hundreds to thousands of years. So the standards and the risks associated with what you need to do in order to build a secure house, and wire a home securely, et cetera, are well known and well monitored and documented. Where from a software standpoint, while the OWASP, thank goodness, was formed to start to bring attention and focus around this, it's known how to write software securely, but what's not known is how do you enforce that across 25 million global developers that is growing to 45 million over the next decade. And that's really the backdrop of the problem that we're trying to solve. So it's all about, how do you help a developer build a new skill set they don't have today and build that muscle memory, so when they wake up in the morning, they don't have to think about things differently, because they've ingrained it in their mind and their processes so well that it's just the way that they code, which again takes time and repetition and an approach that most closely mirrors what they're doing today, which is hands on a keyboard and submersed in code level challenges that are framework specific, that is closely mirroring what they're doing day in and day out.
Absolutely. I think, you touched on a really important point there that, there are more and more developers, coming up every day. There's all kinds of people getting into that space. I mean, they're talking now about teaching children coding at primary school here in the UK and secondary school. Now, Christ, back when I was at high school, or what you would term as high school, I mean, we had a computer department, but we all got taught a bit about Excel and maybe programmed a bit in BASIC and COBOL. Christ, that was a long time ago.
I took Pascal in high school and COBOL in college, but I'm not a developer.
No, absolutely. I mean, it's important. I mean, it told me how to read code. I can't develop for anything, but I can at least look at code and understand roughly what it's trying to do. I've kept that skill up because I found that to be quite important. But we're looking at a massive increase in developers, and I think going back a few years, sort of 10, 20 years, as I said before, getting a pen test, getting an application pen tested before it went live was a bit of a dicey moment, because the developers, were a little bit hostile, because I mean, you're dealing with a baby that they've been programming for a year, 2 years, 3 years,
Yep.
4 years, whatever. And the last thing that they want is somebody to come along, find a load of stuff for right or for wrong, and have them have to recode for another 6 months or fix the problems, before it can be released. So sometimes you ended up having a situation where you'd come back with a pen test, they'd still release the software on time, but they would put it into their program to patch that problem over however long they designate. For a period of time, they knew quite often that there was vulnerabilities in their code, and they knew roughly what they were. But because they had to get it out, usually for financial reasons, they would put it on the roadmap to patch. And in that period between release and when that item gets patched, you have that period of vulnerability. And of course, again, I'm writing an article at the moment about, the battle that we have as InfoSec people, because, in that I'm saying that for every one InfoSec person you have who's coding or building an infrastructure that's secure, you have 1 to 2 to 3 other not quite so ethical people trying to find ways to crack in to solutions that you're desperately trying to plug holes. It's like I've got a leaky bucket and I'm trying desperately to stick clay in to plug the holes. And as fast as I'm doing it, there's other people going, oh, I want something in that bucket, and prodding holes with a stick, and everything's kind of, or bits of it is leaking out. So yeah, no, I mean, you guys are, the way that you guys approach, talking to coders and developers in language that they understand, I think it's going to have a really good effect going forward. Going back to the business side of it, I mean, this is an interesting one. Obviously, we spoke to a lot of CISOs. We've spoken to a lot of people who are like, in doing kind of like InfoSec on the ground. How has things changed in the business world from an InfoSec point of view in the last 10 years? Has it become a lot more prominent? I mean, we all know that it's now being talked about a lot more, but are people taking it really, really seriously now? I mean, you deal with big companies, so give us some insight. I mean,
it's a board level conversation today, right? In most organizations. If you just look at the magnitude of the exploits that have happened across the industry, to your point earlier, the shift to digitization and digital strategies and digital transformations that's only been exacerbated over the last year and accelerated, if you will, over the last year. The risks are known. What's hard to get your hands around is how do you feel good about your security posture, and are you doing enough or everything, right, to address the myriad of risks? And there are a myriad of risks. I do think that application security is probably the least mature of the various InfoSec elements, right? And if anything, it ends up being a different. InfoSec is often more network facing and access facing, and application security comes at it from a different lens. but I think it's becoming more and more prominent and more of less of the elephant in the room and more of a conversation, because everything's, shifting to digital, and the risks remain, right? And regulations have maybe heightened the awareness that organizations have to place on that, and maybe the focus that organizations have to place on that. But at the end of the day, it's about protecting brand and reputation, which is the most valuable asset that any of these global enterprises or any organization has, and their customers. And if, the sad thing is that there's almost in some segments of the industry today, a certain level of tolerance or acceptance that, I guess my email was part of that exploit. Hopefully nothing happens from it and you just go back to your general day. But, I think any mature CISO and board understands that you can't bank on that. And, the case studies of the past, back when we were going to school, the Tylenol case study, was a big one. And, what you do to react to that, and then how you respond as far as the new controls or the new processes or the new ways that you do things to prevent that from happening in the future are really becoming more and more of the conversation. And it goes back, you made a comment earlier about, fighting the war. I think that there's an element of that. I'll just play off of it for a second.
Yeah,
that it starts with that reaction mindset, right? That somebody's battling me, so I have to battle back. And I was a Boy Scout growing up, and as an Eagle Scout, I was taught to be prepared. And when you're prepared, then you're able to deal with situations that come up more effectively and more successfully. And that's a bit of the transformation that we're starting to see in the industry, where reacting to issues is taxing, right? Yeah. If you're an organization that's been scanning your applications for any period of time, the number of issues that are identified, far exceed any normal semblance of being able to resolve and remediate those. So there's a prioritization process that occurs, and only the most critical of the critical issues are really able to be addressed as part of that risk mitigation process. And in the best scenarios, as many issues are recreated that are fixed from that last scan, right? So it's a flat line of a trend, which some might say, oh, good, it's not getting worse. Well, it's not getting any better either. And it's already at an extreme, as security becomes defined as quality, has to change, right? And that the risk that's being accepted by only addressing the most critical still is untenable, but you have to get software out the door. You have to, you rely on other mechanisms to compensate for that. But a shift to prevention ultimately starts to change things, right? And you're preparing your people to be able to do things differently tomorrow than they do today, right? So the whole security awareness wave becomes really important. And the more, when you see the transformation, right, it started with videos and presentations, and now it's more exercises, because what it's really trying to do is mirror that real world experience and teach us how to identify a phishing email, and not fall victim to it, as good as it might be. And most developers know those common things, right? They won't go and put a memory stick in a USB drive without knowing where it came from. They won't hold the door for somebody and do all of the things that other less technical people might not be thinking of, right? And as part of those awareness programs. But for them, it's not necessarily that's the risk. It's how are they writing code, and do they even understand what secure or insecure software or code looks like, to be able to do something differently or strive to do something differently. So the level of naivete that exists today is staggeringly high. And that's not a criticism. It's a reality of, again, developers learn most of what they learned on the job. They're not taught it in school. We weren't taught it in school. And if, some of what's taught in school is actually the bad practices, right? And I don't know the specifics, but I know that there's certain functions in C that a security, an AppSec professional would say you would never use that. Yet you go look at, textbooks still that exist today, or, the digital versions or courses, and they're still using that as examples because it's a function that you can use to do, to program in, or to, it's a simple example of how to use that language. So that whole mindset has to shift, and we have to start to think about how do you enable a different outcome, which takes that be prepared mindset, and maybe it's, a better analogy becomes the military analogy, which is the number of training exercises that anyone in the military goes through to be prepared for a situation, so that when that situation occurs, God forbid, that they don't have to think, they just act, and it's muscle memory, right? Because you don't have time to think and respond when you need to. You don't have time to think, how often do we actually think about the sentence structure that we're writing as we type an email or a document? Maybe only when it gets really complex, but that's muscle memory, and we have spell checker to get the, mixing up my E's and I's in certain words. But for a developer, that same transformation has to occur. And we have to get to a point where writing secure code is muscle memory. And it's just the way that you do it, so that because what's top of mind is, how do I get this feature built? How do I get this web page to look a certain way? And that's where the hard thinking is, and how you do that ultimately has to just happen. And that's an experience that takes time, but with continuous learning and with the right approach, it's not only learnable, it's being learned, and organizations are really able to start to make that shift culturally, as well as from a risk balance, and be in a more proactive and preventative stance, if you will.
Fantastic. Out of interest, I mean, something you mentioned, quite close to the beginning of that. Do you see, we're rapidly moving to kind of like a service-based kind of service for IT. Everything's going infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, software as a service. Everything seems to be as a service. The on-prem solutions seem to be dying off quite. We still have customers who say, can we have an on-prem version of this? And occasionally, the vendors that we're talking to, they're like, why would anybody ask for an on-prem version? It's far quicker with what we've got and all the rest of it. Do you think that's also going to make significant changes in the secure development of code, the future of the delivery of services? We're seeing, obviously, something that I mentioned, before we started off. There seems to be quite a significant amount of evidence now that there's attacks on software vendors specifically for getting malicious code into their products, and we're all used to kind of third-party reviews. If you've got someone who's providing you with a cloud, right to audit, everybody's used to that, and most InfoSec people and most IT people, anybody with any sense is obviously gonna, so you're providing us with these critical systems, we want to do a security check on you. Do you see it as a case where these, organizations who are purchasing software might start doing the same kind of due diligence on software development firms, be it, as a service firm or a provider of software? We've all seen the popular products that have come out being compromised, which has caused like 18,000 organizations, both my government and your government, being implicated in that. That's going to kill that company dead. No one's going to use their software anymore. Let's be honest.
It's,
do you see that as a significant...
The answer to your question is they better, right? But absolutely. If you look at our customer base, it somewhat follows how the industry adopted, and who was really driven to secure their applications, if you will, within their organization. So the 20 of the top 100 global banks are customers of ours today. Banks, financial services, insurance, e-commerce providers, those are all big segments. But technology, technology is the next biggest, segment, and it will far outstrip it. And the real challenge in that space is, you're right, more and more we're getting those security reviews and security audits. The move to the cloud, the shift to microservices, so componentizing software more and more, the shift from waterfall, which was the only way back in our day, right, to agile and DevOps, where you've got continuous development and integration occurring all day, every day. That it just makes the problem harder, or it makes the problem even more important and relevant for organizations to address. And the cascading effect that you can realize, in the old days with on-prem software, but that supply chain risk that exists now and that has been exploited most recently, it was only a matter of time, but it opens your eyes to a much bigger problem, which is, no matter how safe you think you are, you're not really safe, right? Anyone that's in the AppSec space today, they'll talk about the argumentation of false positives, right? What's false? One definition of a false positive is vulnerable code that otherwise can't be exploited based on where it is in the stack, if you will. If you go back to how do developers learn how to do what they do, part of that, answer from their friends, and in working with their friends, it's borrowing code, right? And copy and pasting something that someone did. So something that was otherwise not exploitable today might be put right in the front lines tomorrow. So the argument can't be where it is, although it might drive prioritization of what's most important to fix next. And more and more organizations are realizing that even for systems that are offline, I mean, heck, we have COBOL as a language that we support today. Maybe there are.
Use that?
Maybe there are mainframes that are online externally, but it's not that it's immediately exploitable. It's the fact that the applications that the mainframe's talking to are connected to the outside world, and if they're compromised, then that system can be compromised. So what I think that whole supply chain reality that's occurred is really bringing to life is, no software is really safe.
No.
Unless it's completely offline, right? And where does that occur? And every organization has to look at and measure where their risks are and start to think about what they're doing to go transform those organizations and do things differently tomorrow. And I think the hard part, I remember last year, during one of the last conferences that you could attend, I was having a spirited conversation with a CISO from, I think it was from New Zealand. And he was making the argument about, well, why do I have to pay for that? Why is that my job to train, my people to do things differently, right? And it's an interesting argument, right? And in a perfect world, you say, well, it shouldn't be. But if you don't, who will?
Yeah.
Right? And if you don't, what risk are you assuming? And is your job, is your company's, on the line based on the risk that you're assuming? So the good news is that there's been enough focus and there's enough enlightenment out there that more and more CTOs and CIOs and CISOs understand that, their job isn't necessarily to be the audit function of the past, but the enabler to help their organization and their people and arm them with the tools and resources and know-how to be able to do their job well. And part of that definition of well is securely, right? So whether it's the behavior of what you do as you walk around an organization or interact with your internal systems, or how you build those systems and deploy those products, security is quickly becoming more and more of just a quality standard within an organization, but we're not there yet. And we've got to keep pushing towards that, because in the end, that's what it is, right? And if the software is, if the house is constructed and won't fall down, but yet there's no door on, there's no front door in the opening and anyone can get in and out, then is the house really functional? And the answer is no. And that's what vulnerable code is, right? SQL injection's been around for 20 plus years.
Yeah.
It's the most heavily exploited, the easiest thing. So what do they do? It's like checking did you try to open the door? I know there's a handle on it, but did you try to open the door? And how many doors, even in literal homes, aren't locked? Lots of them, right? So, and that's no different than how many queries are constructed improperly and aren't parameterized. Lots of them. And that's, while attacks are typically motivated by, have financial gain and motivations, they're also trying to do the simplest things first. And while, unfortunately, the hackers are often the smartest developers in the world and the most creative, they just have different motivations. The reality is they're going to take the path of least resistance. So they're going to try the easy things first. And if they don't have to go any further, then you're just making it easy for them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So pulling things back to you. So in your field with what you do, it's very different from a lot of the other people I've interviewed. I mean, what do you see as kind of like important milestones? If somebody wanted to get into the InfoSec field, get into the sales side, get into the business side of it and start interacting with CISOs. I mean, you speak to a lot of CISOs, you speak to a lot of, technical people, you speak to a lot of developers, obviously, because that's kind of really where you guys go down. But
yeah,
what would somebody need to do what you do? What are the soft skills? Because I mean, we can talk about hard skills like, sales strategies and all that. I mean, those are all well documented out on the internet, but specifically when you're selling into InfoSec, selling into CISOs and all the rest of it, what are the kind of skills that you would advise people to have who are looking to get into that space?
So I don't know if there's an analytic, or there's clearly a business appreciation and a business impact, right? A CISO is an executive that, even though, some come from a technical, come up through the technical line, more and more coming from the business line, and they're all accountable to the board. So they have to think in terms of their businesses. It starts with being able to have that solution orientation and, taking what's maybe overused, but a consultative approach. At the end of the day, it's not about, I've got the best widget or feature. It's about, my prospect or customer has problems and they're looking for solutions, and I can help them understand how to address, what solutions might be available that they're unaware of that most effectively help them address their problems tomorrow. And doing that in a way that really helps, puts it into that context and that lens. When I look at people that have come into the security side and from different segments or different, backgrounds, it's somebody that's able to think across, to think horizontally within an organization, right? Because this is about connecting dots and bringing things together. So being able to assimilate or synthesize a problem or a solution for a customer, help them understand and extrapolate how other companies are doing that as a best practice. Because the good news in this industry, right, is there's so much so much of a communal focus where everybody is trying to help everybody else because they see themselves all in the same, I don't want to use the word battle, but in the same, working toward the same cause, which is making tomorrow more secure than today is. And knowing that it can be done, and knowing that the difference is, are the right, controls in place, are the right systems in place, are the people enabled with the right know-how to do that effectively. And So if that's interesting to you, and being able to help customers really think about how they can effectively lean into the strategies of tomorrow in ways to do more quickly, and more confidently, I think you're on the right track. But I might be biased because I think, if you're a builder, because you're trying to build towards something, if you're a problem solver, and you're able to assimilate and analyze multiple data points and extrapolate that in more of a business value sense, then it's probably a good, you probably have the skills or are developing the skills that work really well in this industry.
No, absolutely agree. Absolutely agree. As somebody who's been sold to for many, many years, and also helped do the selling, because I'm not a salesperson. I've got people who are much better than that, than me at doing that. You're absolutely right. The consultative approach is always the best, because you'll tend to find a lot of infosec departments are pretty underfunded. They get beaten up quite a bit by the people above and the people around them, because security, it's gotten a lot better in the last few years, but still we do have a bit of a fight when we're looking for budget. And I can kind of, you mentioned that CISO before that you had that conversation with, I can kind of see his point, and I kind of agree with it and disagree with it, because as you say, if he's not checking, or if that person is not checking, then it will never get potentially done if it's not being done. So it does become the security person's problem. Okay, you can do the argument.
And if you have tens of thousands of developers, like scarily any large global bank does, in fact, if you set the standard that I'm only going to hire people that are security proficient in today's world, you won't fill the seats, right? It's not there. And that's the problem is that historically this hasn't been taught, and it's still not being taught. So the number of universities that even, teach secure coding, and you graduate with a CS degree are, still a handful. So the industry has a long way to go as far as recognizing that, but I applaud organizations that take that ownership. And I think they're the ones that are going to be the winners in the end, because regardless of what it is, we all of us rely on our people, and any good organization is looking to transform itself or ways it does things ongoing, and that does require continuous change, continuous learning and improvement, and this is just one component of it. But if you start to shift the balance, you start to make you create a positive culture around it where everybody believes that this is important and agrees that this is important and agrees that it's part of their job, and they're measured on that, right? So if you do that well, then you're rewarded. If you don't, then you're helped, and you have resources that can effectively help you learn how to do that better tomorrow. But it's a complex problem, but one that I think organizations are starting to make that next shift and really finding ways. And, we're fortunate to be part of that wave of moving to prevention and really becoming much more proactive. So you do it right the first time, which anyone, that knows anything about quality is the only way you get, thousands of units out the door without massive recalls. So doing it right the first time and doing it faster and faster and more confidently is what any organization's trying to do across the board.
There's definitely been a shift from what I term from a quite a famous book over here called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Security was always SEP, someone else's problem.
Yep.
Now it's migrating to, well, actually, it's not just the security people's problem, it's actually ours as well. We need to sit down, we need to actually do something about it. We need to talk with the people who are in the know and work with them to make this what we need it to be, And for any of you out there, from the university, please start teaching secure coding. Please, as a module, a section, I don't know, add it.
And for any of those that are taking computer science as a major, be creative and inquisitive and learn how to learn that language and how to write things securely from the start, because you will be the most valued developer amongst your peers. So if you want to differentiate yourself and you want to actually be ahead of the industry, hold the industry forward, get curious about that, find resources that are available and learn how to do it right the first time, because you'll save yourself a whole lot of headaches down the road, and you'll create lots of opportunities as well.
That's a good point that you make, actually, because development, if you can prove that you develop securely, that you've done it in the past, that you've got experience in that you've taken the courses, why wouldn't anybody looking to employ a developer immediately put them at the top of the list? Especially if you're a banking institution or somebody, it just doesn't make sense if you don't, really. But
and we're seeing the benefit of our platform is it's an engaging platform that's submerses a developer in an interactive learning experience with all real to life code level challenges, 50 different languages and frameworks. But tournaments might be fun to create internal competitions and claim bragging rights and maybe some fun prizes and valuable prizes. But our assessment engine, which is now being used as the capstone to determine where you are on a belting progression for security skills, or have you achieved the certification that the organization has rolled out, is becoming more and more of a standard use case across organizations. And that gets externalized, where many of our customers today are now including and using our platform actually as part of the process to evaluate their shortlisted candidates and getting a read on what's their secure code proficiency, which is a great idea, right? And it becomes part of that decision criteria. And once they start to onboard and bring in the next wave of new hires, they're now building into that onboarding process secure coding training as an integrated component of that, so that you're helping the next wave of developers understand that this is how we do things. So I think there's multiple ways that we're seeing the more forward-looking companies really try to get ahead of that prevention curve, if you will, and starting to build it into their processes as they continue to retool and retrain or enhance their existing development teams with those skill sets, so that they've got parity across the board.
Absolutely. Brilliant. Right, looking at the time, we're starting to run out, so I'm going to ask you the critical question I ask everybody. So if you could go back in time, let's say you got your first job in the InfoSec field, you're about to embark on the career that you've just gone on. Maybe you've gone to a bar to sit down and have a pint. You just had that call from the recruitment agent, says you got the job. You're on that high. You sat there thinking, fantastic. Maybe you're in a coffee shop or a bar, whatever. All of a sudden, you go back in time and you can sit next to yourself and offer yourself short pieces of advice. If you could do that to yourself back then, what would you tell yourself?
Wow.
Oh, ticking. I can see it.
I'm going to use a parallel analogy because this is more real to life, which is when I got out of business school, the internet was just starting to really become commercialized, and it was all about eyeballs back then, right? Mm-hmm. And I didn't get it because I was like, well, that's great, but I just came out of 2 years of business school. Don't businesses thrive on cash? And you might have just raised $100 million, but if you're not making money, you're eventually going to lose $100 million and spend $100 million in the process. So if I was thinking about my orientation back then, even because I think it ties into it, is pause and look around you and look forward and maybe get curious about where the industry's going, where technology's going, not to consume yourself maybe in things that are so far fetched, but to appreciate the fact that what's happening today is a microcosm of what will happen tomorrow and what will happen, in the future. So the digital world, the internet is here to stay. The digital world is here to stay, and if anything, it will become an increasingly important part of the future. And find ways to make an impact there, and understand that, and really get excited about the fact that what you're doing today is maybe the least interesting thing about what happens in your career, because every day it's going to change and transform, and don't lose sight of that, right?
Mm-hmm. I love that piece of advice. That is brilliant advice. Right, we've hit the end of it. So thank you ever so much, Stephen, for coming on the channel and chatting to us. It's been brilliant. For those of you out there watching this, if you've got any questions for Stephen, for me, or whatever, the details are in the descriptor on where to send your emails or communicate with us. We'll be more than happy to have a chat with Stephen and get some answers for that. Stephen, again, thank you ever so much. I hope you've enjoyed it.
No, this has been great, Jim. I appreciate the invitation, and thanks for the experience. It's been a great chat.
Brilliant. Okay, so thank you ever so much to everybody who's been watching. Please feel free to press the subscribe button and the little bell for notifications. That way you'll get told sort of when new content is released. If there's any new content you want, or if you want one of our interviewees back on for another interview on something specific, I'm sure I can probably bully them into it at some point or another. But for now, thank you for watching, and we'll see you soon. Goodbye.